Welcome to the Author Your Life podcast, where you can write a new script for your life and become the hero of your story. I'm your host, David McRae. You are the author of your life. Let's get started.
All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you.
In my experience, there's no such thing as luck.
It is not our abilities that show what we truly are. It is our choices.
Before we launch into the podcast, I'd like to tell you about my book, Author Your Life, Become the Hero of Your Story. This is a book for people who are at a crossroads in life and want to make a fresh start. Judging by the fact that you're listening to this podcast, I suspect that you may well be one of those people. This book is going to help you to change your narrative and rewrite the scripts in life that are holding you back. This book covers the latest science and research showing you how to become the person you want to be and live the life that you want to live. I'd like to invite you to get this book not only because I feel it's a great book that's going to help you, but also it's going to support the podcast as well. I love podcasts, but sometimes all of those ads that you get can be really irrelevant and annoying when you just want to listen to a good piece of training or a good interview. So I therefore made the decision with my podcasts that number one, I wanted my podcast to be free so that everyone could listen to it. And number two, that I wasn't going to fund it through all these annoying and irrelevant adverts and commercials. Therefore, if you want to support the podcast and support all the things that I put out there for free, whether it be here on the podcast, my YouTube channel, other areas on social media, then buying a book is going to enable and help that process. So this is what we call a win-win scenario. By buying the book, you help to support my work and all the free stuff that I put out there, and you also get a really transformational book that's going to help you make those changes that you really want in your life. So if you feel you're someone who's at that crossroads in life, you're looking for a new direction, you're looking for a fresh start, then make sure you get this book. Author Your Life, Become the Hero of Your Story is available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and audiobook, whatever your preferred medium, it's there for you to go get right now. Hello, story changers, and welcome back to another episode of the Author Your Life podcast. On today's episode, we have Linda Schwartz. Linda is a stand-up comedian and host of the popular podcast She Shared Comedy, a podcast dedicated to empowering and educating women who are pursuing a career in comedy. She's a personal development junkie, hell-bent on sharing her transformational journey and laughing about the absurdities in life. You'll get to hear about some of this transformational journey that Linda's experienced in this podcast, and there's a particular bit in this interview actually where Linda gets very emotional and very raw and very real with you guys, and I think you're going to find this very impactful. This is probably the most raw and real that I've ever seen a guest on the Author Your Life podcast, and I think you're only going to benefit from that and be moved by it and resonate and connect with that. That will happen about halfway through the interview as you're listening today. Now, not only are you going to have this moment of deep connection with Linda, you're also going to learn a lot of stuff from her as well. In this interview, we're covering things such as why life is like improv. You have to say yes and. Why it's important to appreciate what you already have. The power of seeing someone else's pain rather than just your own. And how humor is a powerful perspective shifter. You're going to learn this and a whole lot more in today's interview. So without further preamble, allow me to introduce to you Linda Schwartz. Linda, welcome to the Author Your Life podcast.
Hi, David. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have this session, especially because, number one, you're a podcaster yourself. So I expect a very good interview from you because you're familiar with the territory. And number two, you're a comedian. So I also expect some jokes as well. So absolutely no pressure at all.
We'll see what comes forward.
So Linda, I always like to start with the why and start with the journey of my guests who come onto the podcast. And this is where I'd like to start with you today as well. So as I've said, you're a podcaster, you're a comedian. Why are you a podcaster and a comedian? Where has all this come from? What's the journey?
You know, I think about this question a lot, actually, because I think about my journey and where my journey has started and where it's taken me and where I am now. And I have to say that I never saw myself as a podcaster. As a matter of fact, a year ago, I didn't even know what podcasting was. But I think that when your intention is to live a creative life and that is your commitment in the world and that's your purpose in the world, sometimes things come forward that you just have to listen to. And I can tell you that when I started podcasting, like I said, I didn't know anything about it. But before that, I was working in a corporate job. I was working 80 hours or more a week. And it was just a soul crushing and soul sucking job. I was unhealthy. I hate to admit it, but I was smoking every day. I was eating terribly. My body, like my face was breaking out. My body was just not in the most optimal state. And, you know, I woke up one day and I just thought to myself, there's got to be more. There has to be more to my life than this. And so I started daydreaming. I came into work a few minutes early and decided to look for one-way tickets. And I was just like, you know, let me just dream a little bit. And so I started looking for one-way tickets to places that I always wanted to go, such as Paris, Tahiti, all these like real fancy and bougie places. And then a thought occurred to me that, you know, my friend Jason was putting this group trip together to go to Bali. And so I reached out to him via text and I said, hey, have you gone on your group trip yet? And he said, no, but I have room for one more. And in that moment, I looked at my reflection in the computer and I said, fuck it. I hope I can say that.
That's fine.
I said, fuck it. I'm just going to do it. So I bought the one-way ticket. I said, count me in. I just bought a one-way ticket. And his response was, are you okay? Like, is everything okay? Because nobody does that. And so I bought the one-way ticket. And of course, now my mind is reeling. You know, all the possibilities are coming forward. I knew that my life was shifting in a trajectory that I could not foresee. It was becoming unpredictable. And so I gave my notice and I quit my job. I sold everything I owned and I packed my life into a suitcase and carry-on bag. And I went on this journey, this trip to Bali, and I stayed there for 2 months and I came back stateside and I went and saw some family and friends on the East Coast, and it became this journey of reconciliation, you know, reconciling with my family, reconciling with my mom, reconciling with myself about what I wanted in life. And as a matter of fact, when I quit my job, I deleted my resume. I was, you know, I don't know if you've heard the talk by Andy Andrews, but he talks about burning the boats. Yeah. And if you haven't heard that speech, go back and listen to it because it's kind of what I did. I decided then and there when I bought that one-way ticket that I was not coming back to this life of working 80 hours a week and working for somebody else's dream and making things happen for somebody else when I knew that my capacity and my capability to create and work hard and contribute to something could have been directed towards my own life. And so with that, you know, I came back to San Diego, which is where I'm from. Where I live, but I'm actually from Savannah, Georgia. But I live in San Diego now, and so I came back to San Diego, and I decided that I wanted to do something different. I knew that if things got rough or if things got hard, I could always go back to a job and make easy money, but you know, in my heart of hearts, I just knew that living a creative life and co-creating a life that revolves around, you know, the idea that I could live a lifestyle by design, which is something that I picked up in the 4-Hour Work Week. If you haven't read that book,
I have indeed. Yeah.
yeah, I love Tim Ferriss, and that was the one idea that I took from that book. It was right around the same time that I, quit my job and bought this one-way ticket to Bali, and so, this idea that I could create a lifestyle by design really stuck with me. And I thought, okay, well, if it's true and I can create this lifestyle by design, then what is it in my wildest dreams that I want to do? And it took a while, but what came forward for me, was that I wanted to write a book. I've always known that I was going to write a book. I've always known that I was, that was something in the trajectory of my life. I just didn't know when. And about that time, when I came back to San Diego, it was very clear to me that that was the next thing that I needed to do. So I did what anybody would do. I deleted Facebook. I got off of social media.
Nice.
I dedicated my life and my energy to writing a book. And I wrote every single day. There was no rhyme or reason. There was no outline. There was no structure. It just flowed. And so for the next 8 months, I wrote my first book, The Audacious Heart, Letting God and Letting Go. And from there, I decided that I couldn't live in San Diego anymore. And so I moved to Idlewild, which is a mountain town in Southern California. And I became a recluse, like any good writer would do. Right? And so I decided that that I was just going to simplify my life and really focus on this idea that I could create a lifestyle by design. And at that time, really what came forward was to write my book, to get reacquainted with myself, to live as simply as possible, which to me meant that, I was really, I lived in a furnished cabin. I had a mini refrigerator. Like it was just, and prior to that, when I was still working in my job, I was in this big 2-bedroom apartment living by myself. I had this huge refrigerator. I was eating out every day. I literally spent, I think 1 month I spent over $1,500 just in eating out. And that was just eating out. That didn't count my, that didn't count my separate grocery bill. And so really it was just, when I moved to the mountains, it was just this idea that I could really craft my life around being a writer, living simply, and creating a lifestyle by design and getting reacquainted with myself. Really, it was just, to decompress. And I did that for 2 years. And then I decided that I would come off the mountain. It took about 6 months before I came off the mountain. And it was a really interesting time because I also decided that I wanted to ghostwrite. And so that was my next venture into making money as a writer. And so when I came off the mountain, I came out to San Diego to facilitate a workshop with a friend of mine. And I stayed with my buddy, Jason. And when I got there, he said, hey, you've got to meet my boss. And so I met my husband that weekend. I met a client that I started ghostwriting for that weekend. And life just started to flow naturally in the course of this co-creation of creating a lifestyle by design. And then fast forward a couple years later, I started taking this course, and I decided that, I really wanted to get back into the creative life. And my creative roots is in comedy. I did improv for many years with an improv troupe here in San Diego. I tried stand-up comedy for my 30th birthday, and it was probably the most exhilarating thing I'd ever done. It was, to a crowd of about 300 people, and I fell in love with it. And so I decided, what came forward for me was to get back into stand-up comedy, and I started doing that back in May of last year. And then the other thing that came forward was I needed to start a podcast. And I was like, I don't know what a podcast is, but if that's what's coming forward, I'll just figure it out. And within 90 days of me having the idea for She Shed Comedy, which is a podcast dedicated to empowering and educating women who are pursuing a career in comedy, I launched my podcast, and everything that came forward and needed to happen happened. And now it's one of the things that I'm most proud of. So, for me, that's been kind of my journey to living a creative life. And for me, it's been this just intuitive, following that intuitive urging and following my heart in many ways.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing all that, Linda. And there's lots of different things I want to pick apart a little bit more and get some more perspective on. The first of which, I think, going back right to the start and the catalyst of this journey, is what did you learn in Bali? Did anything come to you that helped begin all the change that came as a result?
Yeah, what's interesting is that I spent the first 2 weeks with the group that I went with. And then after that, I was pretty much by myself. I kind of clung on to a lady that I met, a really, really sweet lady who introduced me to some of her friends. And from there, I think the biggest lesson that came forward was to trust myself and to trust that the journey was unfolding exactly the way that it should be unfolding, and just surrendering to the idea that life is an improv game. Just saying yes and saying yes and going with the flow and living in the moment. And that was what I really got out of Bali. And the other thing that came forward for me was I never imagined myself being married. I never thought that I would ever have kids. And when I was in Bali, I remember sitting in this cafe and seeing these children playing. And the thought crossed to my mind, like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have a family and have kids? And then my conscious self was like, what are you doing? What are you talking about? This is not in our life plan, But in my heart of hearts, that was what shifted for me. And, as I said, I'm now married and I'm pregnant with my first child. So we are pregnant with
team effort.
So, but really what I learned out of Bali was just to trust myself and to live life like an improv game and just say yes as often as possible.
Mm-hmm. I like that perspective, bringing the improv in. I've done a tiny bit of improv, and one of the lessons that I remember our improv teacher teaching us was everything is yes, and you've got to go yes and. So if somebody says, we're in a bar, and the other person says, no, we're not, we're on the moon, it doesn't work, because then you ruin the flow. So you've got to say yes and. So you're like, yes, we are in a bar, and look over there, there's a massive cocktail class. So it's always agreeing and then adding.
And
so
adding,
it's
right.
Interesting to bring that perspective into life of saying, yes, I accept what there is here, and what can I add to this, and how can I elaborate and expand on what I see before me right now?
Yeah. And what was, for me, traveling to Bali, I've done a lot of traveling, but it was always with somebody else. And I've never been overseas by myself. So just the first week I was really scared. I was, I had a lot of self-doubt about why I was there, what I was doing, if I could actually do it, if I could, be in a place that I didn't know anybody, didn't know the language. And come to find out, it's actually, if you trust the process and if you learn to trust yourself, things will happen that will align for you in a way that it just unfolds so beautifully. Like, I could have never planned the experience that I had in Bali. I had so many beautiful experiences with so many beautiful people. I had breakthrough after breakthrough, and it just became this lesson in motion for me, just
Yeah.
saying yes and being okay with whatever happened. And I never got into any trouble, or nothing bad ever happened. So it was just being open to the experience no matter what. And I think that's what really got me through. And I only stayed there for 2 months because I had some business to come back to in the States. But yeah.
So as well as the lessons from Bali, another interesting experience in that story was this time in the mountains and going recluse, going very minimalistic. What did you get out of that experience? What did that teach you?
That this is a really great question, because again, going back to my time working a full-time job, living in excess, being in a 2-bedroom apartment by myself, having 2 closets full of clothes that I did never wear, having a guest bedroom that I was working too much to even have friends over, and eating out every single night. I mean, three times a day, just buying, just living in excess, drinking a lot, smoking a lot. And what came forward for me in living in the mountains was, I had everything that I needed, that I was enough, that everything that was provided for me was enough. I lived in a cabin that was fully furnished. It was tiny. I mean, it was, you could probably fit, 2 adults is really squeezing in the comfort zone. And so being in that small space, and, even like the biggest thing that came forward for me was having a miniature refrigerator, and knowing that like I would have to go and to the grocery store and be conscientious of what I was buying, because it would only fit so much. and just coming to terms with the idea that everything that I have is enough. I had all my favorite books, I had all my favorite clothes, I had a computer, I had my cell phone, and that was it. That was really all of the possessions that I had in my life at the time. And being in this cabin really taught me that self-sufficiency is an important value that I embrace, and being enough, knowing that I am enough in any situation, and being okay with what I like, being grateful for all the good things that I had in my life, even though it wasn't a lot.
Yeah. I was reading a book recently. It was talking about Stoic philosophy, and one of the things that one of the famous Stoics, I'm pretty sure is Epictetus. I've momentarily forgotten his pronunciation. One of the famous Stoic Greeks, and he had this quote, and it said, "Desire more what you have, not desire more than you have." So the idea being, if you desire what you already have, then you'll be happier. Whereas if you're always desiring what you don't have, you're always focusing on what you don't have. And then that's the source of unhappiness. It sounds to me that in that situation, that's almost what you had. You had so much appreciation for those little things that you did have, and you didn't need anything beyond that little bubble that you'd almost created for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I tell you, it was probably the most profound experience that I created for myself, because in that time, I was reading a lot of books, I was doing a lot of spiritual work. And what came through was that, I mean, the biggest thing, again, is that I am enough. I think a lot of people don't realize that our capacity to feel that way in our own bodies, in our own minds, in our own spirit is there. It's available for us at any given moment. And if we take away all the material things, and I happen to do that deliberately. A lot of people go through the experiencing of maybe not doing it deliberately, but having it happen to them, and being forced into that situation. I feel like it was, what came forward was just this profound sense of knowing that no matter what, I'll be okay. and that I am enough. Um, and I wouldn't ever recommend anybody like move to the mountains by any means, unless that is what is calling to your heart. But I've lived a lot of extremes in my life, and those were the most profound moments.
Yeah. Do you think that still affects your lifestyle now, looking at things in terms of less is more and minimalism? Do you feel that is still an influence on the way that you live now?
Absolutely. My husband and I just moved to our new house. We sold our house and moved closer to the beach. And, a lot of people would have the experience of, oh my gosh, moving, what a pain. It was such a stressful time. But we were just commenting that during our move, aren't we lucky and aren't we fortunate that we don't have a lot of things to cause this overwhelm and this stress? And we were able to pack up our house in a couple of days and pack it up and have it be ready for our movers. And it was probably the least stressful move I've ever experienced because, when minimalism, or when you're minimalist, and you love what you have, the idea of bringing something in to your world and into your space because you can, or because of an impulse, it becomes this interesting dynamic where it's like, for me, I get overwhelmed and anxious if I am feeling like, I'll give you a good example. So, people want to buy you stuff, and people want to have a baby shower for you when you're pregnant, and the overwhelm for me is like, what do I, it's just so much stuff. We have plenty of room for it. It's not about the room. It's the idea that, that because a new baby is coming into the world, you need to have all of these things to make life easier for you. And in reality, you only really need a few essentials, right? Diapers, onesies, wipes, and a bassinet maybe, right? And so like these 4 things are basically the essentials. And, for me, it's been just this idea of, recognizing that there is a conscientious choice in bringing and living a minimalist lifestyle.
Yeah.
I like the idea that when you move, or when you're getting ready to transition to a new place, that you don't need to have that kind of stress. I think that's the biggest idea that comes forward with minimalism, is reducing stress, approaching things with peace of mind, and knowing and having a conscientious choice of bringing things into your world and into your space.
Mm-hmm. That was another part of this journey that I wanted to focus on and develop. You said you came back from Bali, and one of the key things you did was some reconciliation with your family. Would you mind explaining a little bit more about what that process involved for you, and what you were looking to address and what you were looking to grow and improve in that area?
Yeah. So are you ready to get deep?
Yeah, I'm ready. I've got green tea in me. I'm ready to go.
Oh, good. No, so I'll start this off by saying that for the majority of my life, I always felt that if people knew the truth about me, they wouldn't love me. And a lot of that came out of, my parents being immigrants. They came to America in 1979 with just the clothes on their backs, and my 3 brothers. They didn't speak the language. They had to literally start their life from scratch. And there's a lot that goes into that for them. There's a lot of insecurities that come from that. My dad turned to alcohol, so he was an alcoholic. My mom was just an emotionally, psychologically, and verbally abusive person. And when you grow up in that, you start to believe things about yourself. And so that was the conditioning that my family brought to me. And I never had a great relationship with my mom. And so, I was bounced around from family member to family member after my parents got divorced. And I always had this feeling that I didn't matter. Because if I mattered, that situation or that circumstance would have never happened. And I ended up, being in foster care. And at the age of 13, prior to getting into foster care, I was feeling just so depressed and so sad about my life and where it was going that I just didn't want to be around anymore. So I attempted suicide at the age of 13 by trying to take a handful of pills. And that didn't work. But what was interesting out of that experience was that when I came to, I heard this deep voice come forward and say, "You're here for a reason." And back then I didn't really know what that voice was. I just, and now I know that it was my intuition or that spirit talking through me, or if you want to call it God or whatever. But that was that deep inner voice that came forward and said that you're here for a reason. And I remember that moment. And so fast forward, I was bouncing around family member to family member. I always had this feeling that if people knew the truth about me, that nobody would love me. And, if they knew the truth about my family, I had a lot of shame around my family because my dad was an alcoholic. My mom was crazy, it seemed like. I had two brothers who spent time in prison. So we were the family that, other families didn't want their kids to hang out with, basically. We were the people on the other side of the tracks, right? And I was really ashamed of that. I lived with that shame and for a very, very long time. And so I was miserable because of it, because when you're in that state of mind and you're a young child and you don't know how to deal with it, or you don't have the tools, you don't have the environment to help you through it, things get really challenging, and the only option that you think you have is, and I think that's kind of where a lot of children these days are still experiencing that, but that's a conversation for another day. And what came through was that I went through life just feeling this emotional turmoil that I didn't know how to deal with. And the turning point came when I was about, I want to say 22 or 23. I had moved to California permanently. I met a guy. I moved to San Diego. And I was, working, but I still was living with that feeling. And it was just like, God, I just want to be happy. And so I was sitting in my living room one day and watching, just flipping through the channels, and I came across this bald dude on KPBS, and KPBS is like our public access channel. Yeah. And it was this guy hawking a book called The Power of Intention. And, that was Dr. Wayne Dyer. I had no idea who he was at the time. I didn't know anything about personal development. But what struck me in that show that he was doing was just the way that he was talking about creating peace in your life and being happy and following and living the faces of intention and all of it. It just stirred something inside of me, like, this is a thing that I've been looking for. And so I ordered the entire package. I think it was about $300 that I didn't have, but I did it anyway. And around the same time, I also found a book called The Artist Way. And I was at a point where I felt like I was at the bottom of the bottom, like I was putting on this facade that I was happy and happy-go-lucky and all of this, but inside I was just dying. I was dead. I had no, I was just gone. And this was the answer that I was looking for. And so I just committed to doing the 12-week program in the Artist Way. And then I read The Power of Intention and implemented some of the things that he talked about. And suddenly my life, the energy of my life started to shift, because my intention was, I just want to be happy. And I started finding myself being lighter, And fast forward to when I came back to Bali, I did a lot of personal development in the process. I did a lot of courses, went to a lot of seminars, read a lot of books. And I knew that one of the relationships in my life, the biggest relationship in my life, was the relationship that was really blocking my ability and my capacity to be with other women. And when I say what I mean by that is it was blocking my capacity to really allow women in my life, because my view of women, my worldview of women, was that they'll hurt you. They'll psychologically abuse you. They'll manipulate you. They'll make you feel a certain way about yourself. And in that moment, I realized that I needed to heal this relationship with my mom. So when I got back to Bali, I felt like I had all these tools. I did. I read all the books.
Yeah.
I did the landmark forum. I had all these tools to really facilitate this healing. And I remember I got on the plane and I thought to myself, how bad could this be, right? I am a completely different person. I have all the tools that I need to help myself through this situation. And granted, at that time I hadn't seen my mom in many years. And when the plane landed and I saw my mom, she gave me a little, it wasn't an embrace. It was just this distant hug. She patted me on the back and I was like, okay, here we go. We get into the car and we're driving along the highway, and she doesn't ask me how I'm doing. She doesn't say, how was your trip to Bali? She doesn't ask me about anything at all. She just goes straight into her drama. Straight into the drama of her life. And I was like, oh shit, this is going to be harder than I thought. And I got triggered. I immediately just got completely triggered. And it was a clusterfuck of a mess the first 2 weeks. It was awful. I thought that there was no way that I would ever have the relationship, the healthy relationship that I wanted so badly with my mom. The vision that I had for my life and having that really great, powerful women friends was just it was never gonna happen. Yeah. And then about 2 weeks in, I also had the commitment that I was not going to leave until I had a breakthrough with this woman. And 2 weeks in, we were fighting, arguing every day. And then, there were bouts of silence where we didn't talk to each other for days. And finally, I just, I came to terms with myself and said, look, Linda, if it's going to happen, it has to happen now. If not you, then who? If not now, then when, right? And I had to call a lot of people to get grounded. I had to call a lot of, friends and mentors and coaches and people that knew my situation. And my friend Michael, I talked to my friend Michael and he's like, Linda, where's your mom right now? And I was at the house. It was late in the evening. And I said, I think she's at the bar. And he's like, have you ever considered that she's been numbing herself for a reason.
Yeah. Mm.
And then I was like, oh man, yeah. Like it never occurred to me that everything that has happened between myself, my brothers, my mom had an impact on my mom. And in that moment, I realized that, wow, she is a human being. She is going through her own shit. And the impact of her choices has been weighing on her mind and her heart and her spirit for over 30 years. And so that really shifted my entire perspective about what my relationship with my mom was. And I was able to come from a place of compassion, a place of open-heartedness and love. And that night when she came home, I sat her down and I said, hey, can I just talk to you for a minute? And just another tidbit of my story. When I was 16, I was living with my mom, and we were having such a tumultuous time that I left one day. I said, I'm out. I self-emancipated, and I was like, peace, I'm not coming back. And so now, I look at her life and I realize that everybody that she ever cared about left her. Dad, her boyfriend, her children, her friends, And so when she came home that evening, I sat her down and I said, can I talk to you for a minute? And she said, yeah, let me get a beer. Do you want one? I said, no, thanks, I'm good, but you can have one. So we sat down at the table, and I looked her in the eyes and I said, I'm really sorry that when I left, I didn't say anything, and that I just knew that my life needed to move forward, and I'm sorry that I left you the way that I did. And she just started crying and bawling, and I'm crying and I'm bawling. And I just said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that it happened that way. And if I could go back and change that, I would. And she said, it's okay, because I know who I raised. I raised a strong woman. And that completely shifted our relationship. And I said, Mom, I just want us to have this. I want us to have a healthy relationship. I want us to move forward and just be good to each other. And she said, okay. And for the next 2 weeks, we had a blast together. We cooked together. We sang together. It was just one of the most profound and interesting times in my life, because from that moment on, I realized that there was something in taking ownership of circumstances and situations, right? And that relationships, like relationships with your parents, can really be healed by taking ownership and coming to the realization that they're human too. They've made choices in their lives that were the best that they could make at that time, given the information that they had and the resources that they had. And they are operating from their own belief system. And we can alter our relationship with them by altering our relationship with ourselves and taking ownership and knowing that inside of that we can literally create a lifestyle by design, even with the most important relationships in our lives. Yeah. So that was what the reconciliation part of it was for me, was recognizing that there was this deep disconnect with the relationships that I wanted to have with women, and how that connected to the relationship that I had with my mom. And if I wanted to have a healthy, empowering, and loving relationship with other women, at that point, all my friends were male. I didn't have any female friends. And and just knowing that, that turning that relationship around and recreating that relationship with my mom it shifted everything for me. And by the time I left, she said, you're my best friend. And I never imagined hearing that from my mom. I still actually I think I still have the message that she left for me when I left that day, or that week rather. And she said, hey, I just dropped you off, and I just want you to know that I miss you already. And I'd never heard that from my mom before.
Well, Linda, thank you very much for sharing that story and stepping into that emotion, and that power again, showing the reconciliation and the forgiveness and the healing in the relationship between yourself and your mother. I'm sure there are many people who are listening who feel they have a relationship similar to that in their life. It might very well be with their own mother, it might be with someone else in their life. So thank you for having the strength and courage to share that with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for facilitating that and holding space for it to come forward.
Yeah. There was a theme I was noticing throughout that journey, and it was, funnily enough, starting with watching that television commercial and seeing Wayne Dyer and talking about the power of intention. And I get this sense that there's a lot of intention and choice in your journey, in this stage and indeed in other stages. There's a couple of questions I've got asking towards that idea, and the first of which is, I remember you saying, as you're watching Wayne, you start making this decision and this choice of, I just want to be happy. Do you think that happiness really is a choice?
I was thinking about that on my walk this morning, because I do think that it's a choice, but I also think that it's a state of being. I also think that it's self-generated, meaning that that no matter what's going on in your life, it just takes a shift of perspective, right? Again, going back to being grateful for what you have, not for what you don't have, right? Like shifting that perspective of, if I just had more, to I'm grateful for what I have now. I think happiness is the same way. It's shifting our perspective from I'm not happy about something to I'm happy just as I am. And it's a choice inside of that moment. But it's also a state of being, because for me, like, when I recognize that I am unhappy for one reason or another, that I'm in a state of upset, that upsetness is being triggered by something deeper. And if I can recognize that and shift my perspective, and recognizing and knowing that there's something more that I have to look at, that everything is actually okay and fine in that moment. And happiness, I mean, it's also a vibration. It's like this state of, I don't know how else to explain it, but being self-generated in your happiness and in your joy is something that is available to you. I think happiness is available to everyone, because it's not something outside of us. It's something that is available internally, and it is a choice. We can tap into that energy, or we can let these outside forces derail us and trigger us and get us into a state of upsetness. But if we can recognize and have the awareness that your upsetness is being caused by something deeper, that you can really shift your perspective and shift your mindset and shift your energy into that line of happiness, or that line of joy, or that frequency of joy, right, and happiness. And so I know that's I felt like that was a loaded question. No.
Well, you could have said, no, it's not, and just completely thrown it back at me.
But, you know, what I've come to learn is that we are just balls of energy. And, you know, everything in life is energy. There's frequency, there's vibration, and where we tap into those lines determines the frequency of our lives, right? Like when I was younger, I was really in that low vibration of depression and sadness and unworthiness and all of those feelings, you know. But once I started to understand that I could shift my energy up and out of that by recognizing and reconciling those negative feelings, then my state and my energy level has, you know, you come to terms and come to a place of peace, like that reconciliation with my mom healed that negative part of me that said, you know, I can't have great relationships with women because of this relationship with my mom. And because that reconciliation happened and that healing happened, my energy level, my vibration, and my frequency was up leveled. Right. And it's the idea that if you can reconcile and come to terms and create a peace of mind, like peace in your mind and peace in your heart about your past, and get settled with your past, then you've freed up all of this energy. You've freed up all of this blocked energy to move forward. And when you don't have that heaviness in your heart and in your mind, that lightness naturally occurs. That joyfulness and that happiness naturally occurs. So I think that's what I mean when I say it's a state of being and it's an energy that's available to all of us.
Yeah. Well, since you didn't like that question and you thought it was loaded, I'll ask you another question, which I think will be more open and expansive than that binary choice. The illusion of choice, that's something in the Matrix, isn't it? I'm sure they say you've got a choice, but it's actually an illusion of choice. You already made the choice. The other way I wanted to expand upon this idea of intention and the intention and choices that you seem to have put behind a lot of the things in your journey, I've spotted a lot of very dramatic and drastic actions that you've done, even from being young, in terms of running away from home and quitting the job, going to Bali, living in the mountains. I see a lot of very big decisions, and they're big decisions with possibly not being able to come back for them, or possibly them not working out. There's big risks and big failures associated with them. Has there been anything throughout that process which has helped you to make those decisions, or helped you realize they were the right decisions, even if there was a bit of fear and doubt involved there as well?
Well, that's a really, really great question, because when I was 16, I thought I could do anything. So there was absolutely no fear. It was just a decision. Mm-hmm. You know, it was like, I can't live like this anymore, and I either stay or I leave, and I chose to leave. And so there was absolutely no fear. It was just sheer determination and stubbornness that drove that decision. Yeah. Right? There was no way that I was coming back to that environment. It was too toxic. It was just too much. And I knew at that point that because of what's interesting is that the abandonment, the neglect that I was experiencing when I was younger also fed and led to my self-sufficiency. It led to my self-reliance and knowing that I could take care of myself. right? I was cooking for myself at 5 years old. I remember like pushing a stool up to the stove, getting, a pot, putting water in it, turning on the stove and making these instant noodles that we loved. And I was only 5 years old. And so I was already grooming my self-sufficiency. And, sometimes I feel like neglect and abandonment really isn't that, it's emotionally scarring, but if you can shift your perspective and see it as a gift for all the things that it brings you, like for me, so at 16, I was like, I could totally live by myself. I can totally take care of myself. And I already have a job. As a matter of fact, I was working 3 jobs at the time. And so like the evidence of my experience was that I could take care of myself and be self-sufficient. And it happened. Like I never asked my mom for help. I never asked anybody for help. I just worked. I worked really hard. And so that decision was very evident, very clear that I could do that. Now, when I bought that one-way ticket, that was a different experience because it almost felt like I was being, I wouldn't say dragged into the experience. It was like spirit was just taking me and saying, this is what you need to do now. What happened was that I was reconciling within myself. I said, I don't have any debt. I have some money saved up. It became this conscious choice, this conscious decision making. Yes, I'm doing something that I would never recommend anybody to do. But it was always a dream. It was always like, oh my God, I would love it if I could just buy a one-way ticket someplace and sell everything and start a brand new life. It was always a fleeting thought, but I had the opportunity. And, but when it happened in the moment, it was just an impulsive thing. It was like spirit said, this is what's happening and there's no way around it. And then the fear set in right after I made that decision. Like it literally, like 2 days went by and I remember waking up on a Sunday morning, crying my eyes out, like, what the fuck did I just do? Oh my gosh. And there was a lot of self-doubt around whether or not I could accomplish anything, really. It was just like, could I move into this new trajectory of my life without knowing what was going to happen tomorrow? Because I was coming from a very predictable life. I was, working every day, getting up, going to the same job, doing the same things. And then in an instant, it changed because of that one decision. But it felt like I was being led into that through it. It almost felt like no intention really of my own. It was like the intention of my spirit. And I could have, I don't know how to explain it, but it just, there was no way around it. And then the fear set in and I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Is this really happening? And then, you come to terms with that. I came to terms with it and I realized, okay, so this is the next chapter of my life and I'm just gonna do it. I'm committed now because number one, I quit my job. They know I'm going to Bali. They know I hate my job. Like they know that there's no way that, and they've probably already found my replacement. So, and all of these things. So I was fully committed. And so the process was really just this, one I felt I had complete control over. The other one I felt like I had absolutely no control over. But they were big decisions. They were very risky. But when you come when I was 16, I honestly thought that I knew everything. I really did.
As all 16-year-olds do.
Exactly. And it was just sheer determination and stubbornness that got me through that experience. And yes, like while it was very risky, I also I had that self-confidence, right? Like I knew in my heart of hearts that I could do it. And then the Bali thing happened, and I was like, I don't know if I have the capacity. Because I was so comfortable in my life and making the easy money, getting, like having all of my needs met, and then moving into this situation where I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen. I had no control over anything except, my response to the experience. And it was just this unraveling of my old conditioning, unraveling of the comfort. And I think that's what they mean when they say stepping out of your comfort zone. Like I was completely out of my comfort zone. I mean, but also knowing that I could surrender to the moment. I think that was the biggest thing, like I said earlier, was coming to terms with just surrendering to the idea that whatever happened was meant to happen, and it was happening right on time.
Mm-hmm. There's one decision I haven't really had much of through this journey, and this is right at the end point of the story, almost the current chapter of what we've been talking about, and that is the path that you're on now, where your creative energy is going into comedy. And I haven't really heard in your story yet where that comedic creativeness has come from. Where do you think that came from for you? Was there a particular moment in time? Have you always had it? What do you think?
I think that like finding a sense of humor in my life came a lot later for me, because I always had this heaviness around my family and that shame and all of that. But when I started stand-up comedy, I recognized, like these past few months, I've really come to recognize that if I can shift the lens to humor and look at my life through that. And one of the biggest things that came forward for me was the truth of my life is kind of funny. Like, I had two brothers. One of my bits I had, two brothers who spent time in prison. So while other kids my age were writing letters to pen pals, I was writing letters to judges, right? Like, and I do a lot of impressions of my mom, because my mom says a lot of crazy things. But it was really just shifting that perspective. I don't honestly, comedy is very challenging for me, but I love it. I love it. I love being able to look through the lens of comedy and tell the truth about my life in a way that is impactful for other people. Like a lot of comics have observational comedy about life that's going on around them. Mm-hmm. Mine is really based inside of my family and my life and the things that my mom says and things like that. So, it's been that in itself has been a journey for me, because just being able to shift that serious lens into a comedic lens has been very, very fun and very interesting, because now I can poke fun at things, because I've already reconciled a lot of that. Yeah. Right. Like, I think it's challenging when you're trying to poke fun or trying to see through the lens of humor when you haven't healed a lot of those things. At least that's been my experience. And that's why, comics these days are self-medicating and dying, because they haven't really dealt with the deeper issues that come forward with their lives. And so I feel like that has been my shift. That has been my experience, where I've done a lot of reconciliation. I've done a lot of work healing. And now I can shift into that lens of saying, okay, so this is, this is what happened and this is what's really funny about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just as you're saying that, makes me think of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Have you read
I've read
that
that,
book? Yeah. There's all sorts of interesting things that you pull out of it. It's such a deep book. It's so small, but so deep at the same time. And there's one bit that I remember reading. It's maybe about a page and a half. And he's talking about finding humor in the concentration camps. Where anyone who's listening doesn't realize, Victor was a Jewish psychiatrist in Nazi concentration camps. And he talks about his experience. And there's this page and a half where he's talking about they would occasionally use humor as a coping strategy. It'd be things like, what do you think's on the menu tonight? Haha, probably watery soup as it always is. And it was so bizarre to be reading this book about something that's so horrific, and still in that book, he's talking about humor and other various positive emotions. There's a little bit of gratitude and hope that he talks about as well. But I think it's interesting that humor quite often seems to be that perspective shifting tool that you're talking about. I notice I do it quite a lot myself. Like, I'll take the mickey out myself, and I'll have self-deprecating humor, and I'll point at the things that I do wrong and the things that aren't going right in my life and kind of make a joke out of them. And it's interesting that humor quite often seems to be that tool that people use.
Yeah, because I really do believe in the cliche saying that laughter is the best medicine, because like on an energetic level, if it literally, it shifts you out of it so instantaneously, right? Like, it is one of those vibrational things of recognition. Like, there's a recognition of another person's pain or another person's strife in life or whatever, but that recognition is what and if it's done right, like, the comic is really shedding light on that deep dark thing that is happening and saying, look, it doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to sit in that feeling of despair and turmoil and torture.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually laugh at it, and you can actually see it from a different perspective. And even and I think that's the laughter part of it, is that instant recognition that, oh wow, it's a literal shift in perspective on an energetic level.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about it. Yeah, it's really, and the masters of it are really, I think, are healing. They're healing the world, one laugh at a time. And sometimes they do it in stadium fulls. And I think that upliftment, we need more of that. And I think being a comic is one of the most, it's such a privilege and an honor, because you're literally lifting people out of their shit.
Yeah.
Like their muck and mire, like that internal stuff, and shifting their perspective. And that for me is magic. Like, that is, I'm definitely not a master at it yet, but it's certainly like the thing that I'm looking at to craft and use my life for,
Yeah. So I'd like to start rounding off all of the ideas that we've been talking about so far. I've got a few last questions I'd like to ask, and just because these are the last few questions, don't feel that you have to give short answers to them. Whatever the answer is, that is the answer. And the first question is relating back to something you were talking about earlier, talking about living in the mountains and finding this appreciation for the things that you have. So this question quite simply is, what are you grateful for?
Oh, this is great. So every day at 12:34, my alarm goes off and I ask myself, what am I grateful for today? And that's something that I borrowed from a good friend of mine. But today I am grateful for just being in the energy of healing and the energy of this. So we moved closer to the beach, and this energy is just so peaceful, this peaceful energy at the beach. I'm grateful for this new life that is growing in my belly. I'm grateful for this conversation that we're having. I'm grateful that you've come into my world and into my life to facilitate such healing on a deeper level for me and on a deeper level for your listeners. I'm grateful that you're doing that you're working your calling. I'm grateful that I'm grateful for the air and the oxygen and the life and the aliveness that I feel in this moment.
Oh, lovely. Thank you for putting some of that gratitude onto me. spreading the appreciation.
Yeah.
With the alarm, why 12:34?
You know,
That's such a specific time.
I know, and it's interesting because it's 1, 2, 3, 4,
Right.
just just to be conscientious that time is, for me, it's just seeing 1, 2, 3, 4 is like right now, and it's almost like a countdown, like 1, 2, 3, 4. What are you grateful for?
Yeah. That's like a little rhyme, isn't it? 1, 2, 3, 4. What you
Yeah.
for?
It's like a chant.
One,
Mantra.
yeah. One of the things you mentioned in your appreciation was the new life that is incoming, and we've talked about some of your childhoods and also hinted to your forthcoming parenthood as well. And one of the things that I think is so important, something I hope to be able to do more of my work as my kind of career and calling progresses, is to do more of this sort of stuff with children and to bring more of the ideas of personal development and self-nourishment into young people. Because so often, as your story has kind of revealed, is that people come to this sort of things later in life when they're already messed up, when they're already scarred, when they're already unhappy, and they're reversing all of the damage rather than just kind of starting from the clean slate and building upwards from there. So I think if we can get down into the young people and children, there's a lot less things that they've got to work through and rewrite. They could just start writing on the blank pages, on the blank script. And I think I've said this in the past couple of interviews that I've been doing, that the next part of this century coming up is very, very important. I think there's going to be a lot of key changes in looking at the environment, looking at technology, looking at politics, looking at health, looking at global happiness. There's all sorts of things that are very prominent and will be more so in the decades to come. And ultimately, the young people and children right now are really going to shape the way that this next century is going. If you've got a child born right now in 2019, well, they're probably living till 2100. They'll be living to the end of the century most likely, and they'll get to see what this century is going to be about. So the question is, if you were speaking to one of these children, someone born in this year, as indeed your child will be, actually, funnily enough, what would you want to say to these children, and what perspective or lessons or advice would you be giving them to help them to live the life that they're capable of living in this century to come?
Oh boy, that's a very deep and inquisitive question. This is something I've actually thought about, but for me, what's coming forward is that if I had the opportunity to sit down, and if I could talk to my son and he could understand me right here, right now, I think what I would say to him is that number one, there's always going to be different perspectives, and your reality is really based on your relationship to how you're experiencing yourself in that moment and yourself with other people. And I think that the bottom line is to always be kind, be courteous, and treat everybody with dignity and respect. And, I don't know if that will change anything for him, but I think having that foundational value of kindness and caring can shift, especially for himself, can really shift the energy of the world. And I don't know if it has to be more complicated or more complicated than that. You know, I think that's what we really need is to and I think that is what the foundational values of what I want to teach my kid is, number one, of course, like kindness, caring, treating people with dignity, respect, and also just knowing that no matter what, he's loved, he matters, his voice matters. And I think, really giving him everything that I never thought that I had. I don't know if that will work, but I'll try. And also, I don't know. I mean, that's such a great question, David. I haven't really had the opportunity to think about that, what the impact of what those things mean. But I know that if I just raise a kid who is well-rounded, self-sufficient, kind, caring, and giving and generous, like I think that I would have hopefully done my job as a parent, and I honestly still think that I'm gonna fuck up in a lot of ways. You just never know, you really never know what it is that they make meaning about.
Yeah.
But he will, like that's the thing. I don't know. You just never know.
I remember I had an interview about a year ago on the podcast, and I was speaking to a lady, and she was like, I was speaking to my daughter, and I said to her, my daughter, look, I've screwed you up in ways that you don't even realize yet. And one day you're going to go along to a Tony Robbins seminar, and you're going to be doing all this work, and you're going to be like, oh, see my mum, she did this and she did that. She made me look at the world this way. And I think at the end, we're talking about blank scripts and having a clean slate with children. And at the end, we can't make that work that we do with them perfect.
Right.
There's going to be imperfections in that process
everywhere, because we don't know what they come through for, right? We don't know what the intention or the purpose of their life is, or what their lessons are going to be, or what their earth schooling is, what their curriculum really is. Like I just hope that I can provide the tools necessary for him to handle things that come up in a very loving, like self-loving way, and also loving to other people or caring, because I know that for me, growing up in a toxic environment, I mean, that I see it now as a gift, but in the moment you're just like, I don't want to fucking be here anymore. I just want to die, and then you recognize, but you grow into it, that becomes your curriculum in life, and that's the thing that you come to heal and learn. And without all of those experiences, I don't think that I would be where I am today. Like, just I have so much peace of mind and peace in my heart, and because I've been dedicated and devoted to doing the work. Now, with that being said, my husband and I are in a position to give our child everything that he wants, and are we going to do that? That's the question. And for me, like, in my mindset, it's like, no, he's gonna know what it's like to work and earn a living and go through these motions, and what we want to do is prepare him for the real world. There's a lot of children in this generation who take for granted what they have, and I think as a parent, my job is to prepare my child for the real world in as many ways as possible. And one of the things that we're going to do, what my husband and I have talked about is, it's the American way. So my child is going to know what it's like to pay off debt, because we have decided that since he's been in this float spa, do you know what a float spa is?
No.
So a float spa is like, it's this new relaxing technique where they put you in a hyperbaric chamber that's filled with salt water. And
A flotation tank.
Yeah, like a flotation tank. Right?
Yeah.
Like he's been in this flotation tank for, his entire time will probably be a little bit over 9 months. So we figured that an hour in these little flotation tanks is like $75. So over the life of over the time that he's been in here, that's going to be about $500,000. And there's going to be, we're going to have a womb impact fee, a vaginal trauma tax. We're going to have, all these things. So he's going to know what it's like to come into this world with a shit ton of debt that he has to pay off, because, and then he's going to have to work for it. So, we are providing him with this really nice lifestyle, but he's going to know what it's like to pay rent. He's going to know what it's like to pay for his utility bills. And I swear by the time that he's 3 years old, he's going to have a very, very well grasped, a big grasp of what it's like to be responsible in this world.
That sounds like about $1 million of debt that he's going to have to pay.
Exactly. So he is going to know what it's like to live in this world right here, right now. No. But, obviously we're just joking about that, but on some level, we really just want to raise a well-rounded kid who is responsible and knows his worth in the world.
Yeah. So we've been talking about life and birth there, and I'd like to look at the opposite side of the coin. And I'd like to just finish with a few thoughts on death and the finiteness of life, because all of us so far, barring future inventions, have a finite lifespan. We all have a limited amount of time here on the earth plane. For you, when one day you have your final day on earth and you get to look back at all of the time that you spent here, what legacy do you want to have left during that time?
Oh boy. I think what my contribution in the world will look like is just one of generosity and kindness. And really, I really mean it when I say that I want to raise a kid who treats people with dignity and respect, because I think we need more of that in the world. And that's those are the values that I try to live by. And so I hope that when I leave this earth, that people would recognize, my contribution as somebody who treated everybody with dignity and kindness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And a little bit of humor.
Yeah, of course.
Hopefully. Hopefully they'll come back to that Netflix special and be like, oh shit, I remember her. She was good.
So speaking of humor, for people who've been listening to this interview and they've enjoyed what you've shared, the lessons, the story, the adventure, the emotion, where would you point people towards to find out a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and the things that you're involved in?
Yeah, so if you want to learn more about my podcast, if you're a woman who is pursuing a career in comedy specifically, you can go to shesheadcomedy.com. Or you can reach out to me on Facebook. You can find me under Linda Schwartz or She Shed Comedy. And yeah, I'm really active on Facebook, so come on by and say hi if you'd like. And
that will be all in the show notes, of course.
Yeah.
Linda, thank you very much for your vulnerability, your openness, your enthusiasm, your energy. I could go on and on with what you brought to this interview today. I've really enjoyed it, and I don't just say that at the end of every interview. I've genuinely really enjoyed the time that we shared and the things that we've talked about, and I hope that everyone listening has enjoyed it as much as I have.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be here.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it hugely if you could head over to iTunes and leave a rating and review for the podcast. With your review, please be as honest and detailed as you can be, because with honest and detailed feedback, that helps me to adapt and grow this podcast to most serve you, the listener. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, then make sure you subscribe to the podcast. That way you aren't going to miss any of the future episodes that we've got lined up for you. Until next time, remember that you are the author of your life. You hold the pen, and you can write whatever script you want for yourself. So go out today and write yourself a beautiful story.